one of the there's many interesting features of the crisis, and when we had the workshop to begin this volume a year ago, I guess now, there was just an incredible range of assessments of where we were going, the structure of the crisis, and trying to understand it. I think that partly has to do with what is covered in the volume, particularly in Anwar Sheikh's essay, but also, as David will speak in a bit, just the volume and magnitude of this crisis, with some $50 trillion in assets wiped out, $21 trillion in bailout money, and on the volumes go. It's just incredible. The volume of it. Another feature I think that has to be accounted for is the way that forms of resistance have been popping up in unexpected places throughout this. Often at the margins, but often sometimes in the center. Some of the strikes that occurred over the summer in France, the volume and inventiveness of many of the actions in Greece. The events, of course, over the last few weeks in Tunisia are also a reflection of particular features of the global crisis. And I think we're still in a phase, whatever we might make about the pessimism of some of the events that have occurred, that are going to be a huge range of important forms of resistance popping up in unexpected places. And it's hard to see, given what Leo began with on the nature of the crisis and some of the issues in terms of long-term stagnation. I think this is going to be with us for a long time, which poses, I think, in a major way, questions of how we are going to politically respond, not only in initial insurgencies, but over the longer term of building capacities to overthrow and break neoliberalism. But this is completely tied up in this period, given the power structures, with breaking with capitalism, in my view. The second thing about this is the rapidity with which the crisis has switched its forms. What began in 2007 as essentially a liquidity crisis in subprime credit markets mutated into a general insolvency crisis across a range of financial institutions, and very quickly into a whole range of countries. Brian was laying it out in terms of Ireland as one case where a liquidity crisis, a general insolvency crisis started involving, but also in Latvia, Iceland, and so on. So it would completely and quickly move centers. Now the volume of the asset bubble and the financialization and the way it collapsed meant it soon morphed into a general economic crisis. That economic crisis unfolded through 2008, 2009. It had led to a contraction in the world market. In the advanced capitalist country, the average rate of output fall was about 2.5% to 3%. For the first time since the Great Depression, there was a general decline in the world market and in world trade. So this was a crisis that encompassed the whole world market, and no zone was left untouched by that crisis. In response, there were a number of rescue strategies that the capitalist class and capitalist states deployed and had immediately deployed. And I think it's important to keep in mind this was in the context of what was generalized neoliberal forms of the state. And there was in mind not to repeat the problems that occurred in dealing with the great crisis of the 1930s. So immediately the state moved in a number of specific forms. One of the ways that the rescue took was, of course, immediately attempting to shore up and deal with the banks that were collapsing, rather than allowing them continue the collapses continue to unfold. The second thing is the central banks and treasuries began intervening in a range of securities markets, commercial paper markets, in the general money markets as a whole, to attempt to make sure that the liquidity was maintained and those markets were functioning at some level. For quite a period, this depended upon the state doing so. For about a year and a half to 2 years, this, as we've seen from the WikiLeaks, this was in the data there, this was an intervention of the American state across the globe and sustaining it for about 2 years. Thirdly, is that there was so much fraud, deception, problems, and trying to understand what was on balance sheets. The regulatory institutions moved into the financial sector in major ways to try and start looking at what were the problems of each individual firm's balance sheets and their leverage position, and attempted to try and start sorting out the books and reestablishing each of those institutions. The central banks also then were involved in driving interest rates basically down to zero across the advanced capitalist world, which also drove interest rates down around the globe. And the final thing that was important in terms of the rescue strategies is there was a coordinated response with the first major meetings of the G20 in Washington, followed by London and Pittsburgh, to coordinate a fiscal rescue strategy, which were to move the G20 states into a fiscal position of about 2 to 5% deficits, to try to make sure there was effective demand to stop the world market from collapsing. The other component of the G20 was an attempt to prevent a ratcheting up of tariffs and any kind of protectionist measures from spiraling, to try to ensure that global free trade was maintained. So you can see that the forms of the rescue strategies were quite clearly set in opposition to what had occurred in the 1930s to prevent a breakout of the same kind of unfolding crisis over 10 years through the 1930s into the 1940s. But this just pushed, in many ways, the crisis into a different form. And this is the stage of the crisis that we're now in terms of it taking the form of a public sector crisis. The effect of these measures, both of the movement into deficits, the movement, the shock to revenues from the decline in output, and the bringing in of so much of the bad loans, etc., that were on banks and other financial institutions' balance sheets into the public sector, has mutated into a crisis of the public sector as a whole. This is the case across the advanced capitalist country, but as Brian was mentioning, how we understand that depends a lot on the nature of the banking crisis that occurred in each case and the form it took, the way that the public sector crisis is unfolding. There is a number of important themes, what's happened in and around the exit strategies and some of the difficulties that are occurring that show that we're still in, I think, I would say a phase of the crisis, a different phase of the crisis, but I would also think and say that we're still in a phase of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism not in the sense of every practice reflecting less market and less state and more market, but in the general ideological way that states are addressing the crisis, which was the key to neoliberalism as a whole, not that it was less state and more market, but also the way that they're attempting to reestablish many of the key distributional features of neoliberalism, many of the key financialization features of neoliberalism, and the way that they're attempting to restructure the state. One of the exits that has occurred, occurred, is around the question of additional financial regulation. And that was a theme of so much of the social democratic movement, that the crisis demonstrated that you could not leave markets to themselves. You had to have extensive state regulation of the financial sector. And the consequence of the crisis was to be a form of financial regulation that would rein financial capital back in. But when we look at the measures that have been taken, these are incredibly modest. There's the small German measures that have been taken on short selling. There's been some small European Union measures on controlling aspects of incentive structures and payments to the banking sector. There's been the modest measures of the Basel Accord, which are pushing banks to tighten up their balance sheets and their leverage ratios. And of course, in the key case in the US, we had the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform Bill, which really demonstrated, I think still, the power of Wall Street in the reforms. There's very little that shakes up Wall Street. And what's the quote that Doug uses in his essay? I was asked to write on Wall Street, what happened? Nothing. End of essay. You know, it was so little that the financial reforms have done in transforming the nature of financial power in the U.S. The widely discussed thing, the thing that was the main demand over the last 20 years, at least, or not 30 years, was the financial transaction tax, was the main social democratic demand, popularly known as the Tobin tax. And a few countries in Europe have adopted some small measure with respect to this, but it is so tiny and so small that it's even less ambition than the Tobin tax was initially. So it's left much of the nature of financialization in place, and most of the regulatory structures that have been attempted are attempts to reestablish the forms of financialization that have been characteristic of neoliberalism. The second exit strategy that has been pushed, particularly from the central banks, the IMF has particularly been pushing for this, the Bank of International Settlements and a range of the financial institutions, has been a return to so-called normal monetary policy, to begin pushing back up interest rates, to lessen the role of the central banks in the money markets and in completing some of the shortages in markets. This has been very problematic in moving away from the exceptional monetary policy measures. And you can see it especially in the U.S. with the Reserve moving in its quantitative easing measures of $600 billion that it's added, because of the general weakness of the economies and the fear that we're still in a phase where it could be a quick reversion back to a severe form of crisis, and the instability and problems that still remain with the banks' balance sheets. So that this exit has been hard to move away from.